Since taking office last January, President Trump and his administration have imposed economic tariffs on dozens of countries across the globe. Mr. Trump supported his controversial policy on Monday, saying the levies have been a major boost for the United States.
We've taken in hundreds of millions of dollars in tariff money. We're going to pay down debt. You know, we have a lot of money from tariffs. If we didn't have tariffs, this nation would be in serious trouble. And we've taken in tremendous amounts of money.
However, President Trump is under increasing pressure over rising prices, and last week he rolled back tariffs on a broad range of food imports, including coffee, bananas, and beef. For more perspective on how all of this is impacting the global economy, joining me now from Oregon is Liang. She is chair professor in economics at Willamette University. Also with us from New York is Anthony Chan. He is a former chief economist at JPMorgan Chase & Company. Joining the discussion too is Otaviano Canuto. He is senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and he's a former vice president of the World Bank. And with me right here in the studio is Sourabh Gupta. He is senior Asia Pacific policy specialist at the Institute for China America Studies. Welcome to all of you. Anthony Chan, let's start with those Trump administration's tariffs. Well, that decision taken last week to roll back tariffs on dozens of food products. Now, some analysts and critics are saying this is an acknowledgement that the tariff policy is not working. It's actually hurting American consumers. Now, you've written extensively about this on Substack. What is your assessment?
Well, Anand, it's kind of ironic that the administration has said that when they imposed those tariffs, that it didn't really raise prices. But now they're arguing that when they reduce the tariffs, it'll reduce prices. So you can't have it both ways. But the article that I wrote on Substack basically does find that those tariffs did have an impact on overall inflation. In fact, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis put out a paper in which they find that headline personal consumption deflator, it raised the headline numbers by about 0.5%, and core personal consumption deflated by about 0.4%. Then the Yale Budget Lab also points out in a study that they did that it basically raised food prices by about 2%. And against that backdrop, it is clear that these tariffs did, in fact, raise prices. Now, the only reason why we didn't see inflation much higher is because there were other offsetting factors, like energy prices came down. So when you look at the overall picture, it looked like the impact of the tariff was muted, but you should not be misled by that, because when you focus on food and you focus on tariff goods, we did in fact see higher prices.
Liang, China has been able to adjust to the Trump tariffs, and it has avoided to a large extent a major economic hit. How is it doing that, and how do you see China continuing to handle these tariffs from the United States?
Yeah, good to be with you, Anna, and the panelists. So I think you're right. China so far has weathered this tariff war relatively well in a very resilient, I think, manner. When you look at the export numbers from the first 10 months, export actually grew by 6.2% year over year. And I think China was able to do that mostly through two things. One is that China has been diversifying its trading partners. So even though the exports to the United States has fallen by 18% so far this year. Its exports to ASEAN countries have gone up by 14%, to African countries have gone up by 1/4, and also increased exports to Europe by 7.5%. So all of these help to cushion against the fall of exports to the United States. And also, I think China has been diversifying and improving its trade structures. When you look at the electrical and mechanical products, those exports have gone up by 8.7%. So it's larger than the overall growth in exports. So many of these products, including, I would say, the NEVs, this year we have seen the surge of the new energy vehicle exports by over 90% to more than 2.5 million units. So I think those two measures have been really helping China to continue to have this strong export momentum. And I think, of course, China is working on also boosting its domestic demand. That would, again, help to sustain the kinds of economic growth at home.
Anthony, I guess the United States must be aware that countries like China, one of its major trade partners, are looking at other trading alliances, other trading alignments as well. Do you think that concentrates the mind of those who are imposing the tariffs here in the United States? Anthony Chan? Oh, Anthony can't hear me. All right, let me move on to Sourabh. Sourabh, right here in the studio, you can hear me. China has been India was hit with tariffs, let's see, 50%. But the Times of India reported on Monday that there could be a trade deal in the offing pretty soon. The two sides have been talking for months. What are you hearing?
Hard to say. I would not be too confident of a trade deal too soon. It's going to be a hard slog. The reason I say so is that if one looks at the deals that the administration has had with the Southeast Asian countries, and it has had deals with about 4 of them, it has full deals with Malaysia and Cambodia, very detailed ones, and framework agreements with, I think, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand. If you see the Malaysia agreement, tariffs are an important part, yes. I mean, they've got 19%, Malaysia at 19%, but that agreement has also a lot of other things on non-tariff barriers where your standards have to be harmonized with our standards. That's the US's standards. On digital trade, you have to do blah, 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 blah. US is very aggressive in its demands on things like digital trades. You have to implement the WTO agreement on subsidies, where India has been kind of, on fishing subsidies, right. And India has been dragging its foot. So yes, there might be some degree of meeting of minds on parts of the trade agreement, but I think there are a lot of other sections where India will really have to think through hard if it can sign those. It'll have to get to that point where it needs to sign those to get the tariffs down, which it wants to because it's hurting. But there are reasons to believe, like for example, I think LPG, liquid petroleum cargoes, have just been booked for the first time, and India is going, that number is going to go up from 0.5% the US share to 10%. So there is progress, there is forward movement, but it's a hard slog, the negotiations with India, because India's positions have been are typically a little, they're always ready to say no rather than yes, and it's difficult to make those compromises in a poor country, which is a democracy, and Modi has that challenge. So, but I would not be surprised if there is significant forward movement in that negotiation also with India, considering that the administration has made a fair degree of progress with other Southeast Asian countries, and their trade structures are not very different from India.
Right. Okay, let's get back to Anthony. I'm glad to say that he's now back with us. Anthony, I was wanting to get your opinion on something that Liang was talking about, and that was the fact that countries like China, major trading partner of the United States, they're looking at other trading partners right now, other trading alliances, perhaps more reliable ones. And that must be of some concern here in the United States.
Absolutely, Anand. And that's the reason why they decided to reduce these food tariffs to many countries, so that now we're going to be able to trade with a lot of Latin American countries with reduced tariffs. So again, we want to make sure that even though China may be looking to those countries, that we somehow also do something so that we don't lose them at all. The only problem, Anand, that I see is that we reduced the tariffs on coffee, but we didn't reduce it entirely for Brazil. Brazil is still going to have a 40% tariff. They will reduce the coffee tariffs by about 10%. So therefore, the other countries out there, whether it be Asian or other Latin American countries, will have an advantage. But Brazil, for some reason, is still going to have a handicap because they're still going to be stuck with very high tariffs on coffee, making it very difficult for them to sell coffee beans to the United States.
Right, Otaviano, Canuto, we just heard it there from Anthony Chan. Brazil still facing 40% tariffs on coffee as well as on beef. And it's been one of the hardest hit countries by these tariffs. How tough are these tariffs on Brazilian exports?
Well, look, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here again. We have to keep in sight the different layers of tariffs that Mr. Trump has applied. There are the sector-specific tariffs on steel and this and that. There are the reciprocal tariffs that he announced in April 2nd, right, encompassing a minimum 10% to those countries with which the U.S. has a trade surplus, and a series of higher tariffs depending on the size of the country's surplus with the U.S. And then there is a third layer of extraordinary tariffs, like it was the case with India, alleging the purchase of oil from Russia, Switzerland, and Brazil. Mr. Trump's movement, regret, with respect to tariffs of foods, particularly stuff that is not duly produced in the U.S., impacted the reciprocal tariff component. So Brazil had received on the reciprocal tariff component 10% because the U.S. has currently a trade surplus with Brazil, but the extraordinary 40% with some exemptions and so on was allegedly established because of the trial of President Bolsonaro, et cetera, et cetera. This part is being under negotiation since the meeting of Lula and Trump in Malaysia 2 weeks ago. We had last week a meeting by the Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs who came to Washington to talk to Marco Rubio. And apparently a response will be given this week by the Brazilian government to the proposal made from the U.S. side. Everyone is curious about, in order to know whether there is any component related to rare earth and critical minerals. Brazil is the second after China, largest source of rare earth. There is also an interest by the U.S. in reducing the tariffs on the U.S. ethanol and so on. But this part, this 40%, is still under negotiation. But see, we mentioned Brazil, but there is something broader also taking place with respect to the region as a whole. And we should pay attention. Everyone should pay attention. The flurry of agreements, investment agreements that President Trump announced on Thursday of last week, encompassing particularly Guatemala, Argentina, Ecuador, and El Salvador, because these are specific measures provided for these countries that are considered in this regard friendly to Mr. Trump, right? And those that privileged treatment to these countries will bring consequence to the others. Nicaragua at this moment is really probably very much concerned, as well as Brazil might be concerned with the fact that Argentina, that competes with Brazil in some segments of those, will have a privileged access to the U.S. So, and there are some apparently security concerns are at the core of these measures taken by the U.S., including connections with the relationship between these countries and China. Okay, so pay attention, because this movement by Trump is really a step forward in having, let's say, a proactive policy with respect to the region as a whole.
Yeah, okay. Young Liang, another country that's been hit very hard by tariffs is Japan, a close United States ally. But Japan has seen drops in the exports of its automobiles as well as car parts as well. How serious is this for Japan? And has there been any kind of a knock-on effect on other countries in Southeast Asia and the Far East?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, it's clear that Donald Trump's tariff war is not just about, China or some of the other countries that he sees as a rivalry, but also including these close allies. And I think when it comes to auto sector, Japan actually had already a sort of a deal, right? After pledging $600 billion of investments and so on and so forth, they actually got a relatively low, sort of tariff rate at 15%. But then there's also sectoral specific, automobile sector tariffs. So all of this, I think, does affect negatively, right, the Japanese auto markets. But I don't necessarily think this is definitely not negative knock-on effect on other countries. I think that, in a way, boosts China's exports in those automobiles, especially new energy vehicles. And with that, I think the regional supply chain would also see a boost because of these, large amounts of China's investment abroad, but also with the supply chain in that automobile production. And I think, Japan is in a precarious position, and especially the flare up of tensions with China, that further reduced Japan's tourism income. And so I think that would again weigh on its economy. So overall, I think this trade tariff war has been negative on the Japanese economy. And unfortunately, with the rising tension with China, I think that would add even more stress to their export sector as well as the domestic economy as well.
Anthony Chen, much closer to the United States, of course, its northern border. At its northern border is Canada. And these tariffs continue to have an impact on Canada. The Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, he was here at the White House last month. This is some of what he had to say. Let's listen.
We are staying calm, okay? We're focusing on what we can control, which first and foremost is how we build at home. And secondly, with our negotiations with the U.S., when they're on, when they come back on, is what's in the best interests of Canada. Not emotional, what's in the best interests of Canada. They will only agree, the Americans will only agree, as is the case in any trade negotiation, something that also is in the U.S. interest. There are a number of things where those interests align. And we'll wait until they're ready.
So, Anthony, Canada is a huge trading partner with the United States. I think 70% of its exports come here to the United States. How are these tariffs hurting both economies? And, I mean, how are they damaging relations?
Well, there is no question that there is a damaging of relations. All you have to do is visit Canada, as I have recently, and you can see that there is not a lot of love for Americans in Canada. But what is happening with these tariffs is some of those products that are sold to the United States, like lumber into the United States, because of the high tariffs, Canada's had to move and sell those products elsewhere, which means that the price of lumber has actually risen. There's upward pressure on the price of lumber in the United States, and that already is hurting the U.S. housing market even more. Keep in mind, Anand, that the U.S. housing market has had, when you look at residential private investment in housing, 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. So for all practical purposes, the U.S. housing sector is already in a recession. And the U.S. housing sector also has an affordability problem. I did a Substack article that I looked at the median household and how much they earn, and I compared it to the median price of purchasing a house, and there's a gap of about $40,000. And so when you then raise the price of lumber, raise the price of building a home, and there's already an affordability gap, and mortgage rates are still high, this creates a real problem for the U.S. housing market, and it creates a problem for the U.S. economy. The only good news, Anand, is that when I look at housing, it's about 4.5% of the overall economy. But that sector is in a recession, and this situation with Canada is certainly not helping.
Sourabh, getting back to India, the tariffs are also posing political challenges for the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, particularly in one sector, that's agriculture. The Prime Minister has said he stands with farmers. Farmers, of course, are a major political constituency. This is what the Prime Minister had to say. Let's listen.
The farmers of India, the fishermen of India, the livestock keepers of India. Prime Minister Modi is standing like a wall against any harmful policy concerning them. India will never accept any agreements that harm its farmers, livestock keepers, and fishermen.
So the Prime Minister is also trying to get a trade deal with the United States. I mean, how much of a balancing act is this for him? And again, in this relationship, how much political damage has been done?
Oh yeah, that's a lot to unpack out there. First of all, on the agricultural front, there is very little space for Mr. Modi to make compromises. India has very high ag tariffs, etc., and it's kind of become dependent on those tariffs in many ways. And of course, this impacts huge amount of livelihoods. I mean, small farmer, smallholders, etc. He does not have space on agriculture to make significant compromises. And if you do look at, say, the agreements with, again, coming back to the Southeast Asians and all, they are not liberalizing the ag markets fully either. And actually, even the Koreans and the Japanese, they're giving additional access, but it's not like, okay, we're taking our tariffs down to 0 or massively increasing tariff rate quotas. So there is space for India to negotiate its way out a little bit on agriculture and not make many compromises. But then he will have to go the added distance on non-tariff barriers, on industrial products, on digital services, etc. He'll be forced to that. And, you know, one of the things Mr. Trump has been going after all the countries is, hey, you need to invest in my country. You need to commit 550 billion, and Koreans by, what, 300 billion or 350 billion, even the Malaysians, 80 billion. The Indians will have to pony up some money. I mean, it's a poor country giving money to rich countries, and obviously it's places because Mr. Modi paraded himself as being this Trump whisperer, and he was waiting for Mr. Trump to come to India for the BRICS summit so he could bask in the reflected glory. None of that has worked out. But he also knows he just has to swallow it and he has to make it work. So as I told last time, he will do what the Americans mostly want, but he will do it after a decent interval. We've not seen any adverse actions against the Americans. There's been a lot of talk, jingoistic, nationalistic talk. But once that steam blows over, a lot of these concessions will have to be made, and I mean, they'll have to live with it. And it's unfortunate. This is not the way trade negotiations should happen. But
right, but there is a strong political component to it.
Oh yeah, right? Yeah, absolutely. There is a strong political component. Yeah. And once the trade agreement is live and people can read through it, they'll say, what, you gave this, and everything away? Come on, you were this man talking tough, and it will. But he will be able to protect, I believe, most of his agriculturalists and fishermen, because he does not have an option. I mean, he will be turfed out of office soon if he doesn't.
Right. Otaviano, Canuto, there is another complication in all of these tariff discussions, these tariff negotiations, and that is, it is now in the United States Supreme Court. It's been taken to the United States Supreme Court, where the justices have been asked to rule on the legality of the Trump tariffs. I mean, the main argument being that the White House is not or should not be in the business of raising revenue. What if the court rules against tariffs? What then?
The question is that, indeed, the characterization used the law, the EPA, it was the simplest way, giving flexibility for Mr. Trump to establish the tariffs as he did. But the fact of the matter is that clearly, according to the U.S. law, is not up to the executive to define taxes and so on. But the outcome of the Supreme Court will only come probably close to mid of next year. So in between, the tariffs will prevail. Mr. Trump has the alternative of using other laws to replace those ones. Okay, that's going to be troublesome, but it's doable. We should not count at the end of the day simply on the Supreme Court. One important point, Anand. Last week, we also had the annual report of the WTO and G20 on the tariff structure over a year. And interestingly, of course, the average tariffs in the world went to the moon with Mr. Trump's policies. But at the same time, the WTO counted many other trade liberalization measures, trade facilitation measures, and so on. So this is important to realize that the rest of the world, not only basically mostly did not retaliate to the U.S., but also is moving forward still on trade integration. So not all is lost.
Yeah, Anthony Chan, I want to talk about Europe. Europe did do a deal earlier this year with Trump. There was a 15% tariff ceiling on most European goods imported into the United States. At the time, the European Union, the European Commission president actually was criticized from some quarters for having negotiated a bad deal. But, you know, we see this sort of inconsistency from the White House. I mean, how does one explain that?
Well, it's very difficult because it really illustrates the mercurial nature of the president. One day he loves the country and he's making concession, and then the next minute he gets upset and he raises those tariffs. You saw that with Canada because of a commercial. You may see that with other countries around the world. So it is very difficult for any country to negotiate, because any decision or any negotiation or agreement can be broken at a moment's notice. And that is the problem with not only with Europe, but it's also true in almost any part in the world that an agreement is made. And they felt that Europe made too many concessions in that agreement. That was a genuine criticism of that agreement.
Yeah. Liang, we are seeing inflation rising here in the United States. But if we look at this very broadly, and we are talking about the global impact of tariffs, what are the long-term effects this is going to have on global growth?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I think for the United States, at least what we see is that inflation is creeping up, but as Angelina pointed out, there are some offsetting effects. But again, according to a very recent research report by the San Francisco Fed, when they looked at back in 150 years when the United States raised tariffs, what it has done actually is to depress and dampen demand and growth, and that actually exerted some sort of deflationary pressure in the economy. So the fact that we're not seeing a lot of inflation going up, it's not necessarily a good thing. It's not necessarily a positive sign. It could be that the economy is being dragged down by these kinds of trade disintegration and also impact on the supply chain and manufacturing, production and so on and so forth. So I think globally, according, to what I just heard from others too, is that countries do wanted to trade with each other. They wanted to promote more, open trade, and so that could help to offset some of these tariff impacts. But again, I think this is a tug of war, right? When you have tariffs, when you have trade barriers, this does, create supply chain disruptions,
right,
affecting side, and it also reduces demand at the same time. So I think the impact could be stagflation, right? That you have inflation on the one hand, but also slower growth on the other. So that is not conducive, I think, to global prosperity. And
so very quickly, I got 30 seconds. There must be domestic political pressure on President Trump right now with these tariffs and what's going on. The Republicans just lost in elections, and there's, of course, the important midterms coming up.
I mean, the affordability crisis is real. I think even the Trump administration know that. Whether they have solutions to it, I don't think they do.
Okay. Yeah. We are going to leave it there. Thank you to all of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.